Hey, I hope you guys are doing really good. It's another week. Interestingly enough, we made it to week 10, which is pretty good. It means the semester is almost over. So you guys basically have 4 weeks more till the semester is over. So today, or this week, we're gonna be looking at chapter 12, and in chapter 12, we're looking at basically the business cycle, right? So we did talk about the business cycle, I remember in chapter 4. And the business cycle is basically the upswings and downswings of economic activity over time, right? So, for example, why is the economy always not expanding? Why do we need to go into a recession? So, for example, currently we are getting out of a recession. But why are there ebbs and flows in the economy? Why doesn't the economy expand over time? Why isn't there a continuous recession over time? Why are there business cycles, right? And that's something basically most macroeconomists have really thought about over time, and they've tried to explain it. Okay, so we come up with different theories to actually explain it, and we'll go through those theories. But the chapter basically uses the fundamentals of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, which we learned in chapter 10, to try and predict business cycles, and not only predict business cycles, but to actually understand business cycles. Okay. Um, and then in terms of inflation, we already know what inflation is, and we've seen causes of inflation to some extent. Especially in the long run, we know that inflation is basically a monetary problem. So the more money you print, the more you increase money supply, right? The higher inflation tends to be, especially if money is printed at a faster rate than GDP growth. Okay, right? So in that sense, we sort of understand inflation, but using the principles of aggregate supply and using the principles of aggregate demand, we can sort of understand how inflation in an economy is caused or comes about, especially in the short run. Okay, so the long run relationship between quantity of money and the price level basically sort of explains how inflation comes about in the long run, right? But what about in the short run? So when we say in the short run, basically we're talking about the short period, okay? Right? So that is what we're going to be looking at in this chapter. We're going to use the building blocks of aggregate demand and basically aggregate supply to try and understand all these things, right? So again, I always go through the learning objectives. I feel like the learning objectives are pretty important. So long as you master the learning objectives and you have an idea of what the learning objectives are, again, you can actually master the chapter, okay? So let's just go through the learning objectives, okay? Right, now, after this chapter and after this week, right, you should basically be able to understand what we mean by the mainstream business cycle theory and what we call the real business cycle theory. Okay, so the mainstream business cycle theory is basically sort of business cycle theories economists or macroeconomists basically came up with a few decades ago to try and understand why there are fluctuations in certain macroeconomic variables like output or inflation. Okay, why does the economy expand? Why do we actually get a recession? And the real business cycle theory is more modern, is more contemporary, and actually the people or the macroeconomists who actually came up with this got a Nobel Peace Prize in it. Okay, and it also tries to explain business cycles, but basically it explains business cycles in a way different form compared to the mainstream business cycle theory. Okay, so you need to know the difference. Okay, also you need to know what is demand pull inflation, right? So what does demand pull inflation actually mean, and what is cost push inflation? Okay, so there are two types of inflation we're going to be looking at, right? And the reason we keep on looking at inflation is that most economists are always concerned about an increase in the price level or increase in prices of goods and services, right? Or the cost of living, right? So we're always trying to understand inflation, and we're always trying to understand how to control inflation, okay? Right? Because high inflation tends to be really problematic in the sense that it actually decreases the value of money and reduces the purchasing power of most people, okay? Right. So in that sense, we'll look at demand pull inflation, we'll look at cost push inflation, and we'll look at how they actually influence output and the business cycle eventually. We'll also look at the causes and consequences of deflation. So if we've already seen what deflation basically is, we know that deflation has to do with negative inflation, so when prices are actually decreasing, right? But what will cause a scenario to actually have or what will cause a situation in where prices or in which prices are basically decreasing over time. And what does it actually mean for prices to decrease over time? Is it necessarily good, right? Because you think prices are decreasing over time, it means things are being cheaper or things are going to be cheaper, but that is not necessarily the case, okay? So we look at the causes and consequences of deflation. Most economists don't want deflation. Most economists don't want inflation either, right? You want a stable sort of stable change or stable growth in terms of the price level, okay? And the last thing we'll look at in terms of this chapter is basically the short run and long run trade-off between inflation and the unemployment rate, okay? That is basically known as the Phillips curve, okay? Right. Now, in that sense, let's start with learning objective 1. We need to understand the mainstream business cycle and what we call the real business cycle, okay? The real business cycle is popularly known in terms of econ lingo, and probably in terms of like economics academia. It's popularly known as the RBC model or the RBC theory, okay? Right, so there are two general theories. I don't know why it's repeating itself, but there are two general theories, right, in terms of understanding business cycles in macroeconomics, okay? We have the mainstream business cycle theory, okay? And also we have the real business cycle theory, which is also the RBC for short, okay? So I'll just call it RBC for short, so you guys actually know what I'm talking about henceforth, okay? Right, now, these are the two theories that so far we as economists or macroeconomists have come up with that actually explains why an economy might go into an expansion or an economy might go into a recession, essentially, okay? Right, so now let's look at the first one, the mainstream business cycle theory, okay? Right, the mainstream business cycle theory, it has this argument, and it actually comes in different forms, right? And it actually says that changes in aggregate demand. So remember we did talk about aggregate demand, right? We said aggregate demand basically looks at the relationship between the price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded, okay? So aggregate demand is basically influenced by spending up what people want to buy, okay? So the amount of goods and services or total goods and services that people want to buy, okay? So changes in aggregate demand around potential GDP, and we said potential GDP tends to be the long run GDP, okay? So it's sort of the maximum GDP a country can produce, or the optimal amount of GDP a country can produce if it uses its all resources, okay? Now, if aggregate demand, which basically influences actual GDP, so aggregate demand influences actual GDP, now, if aggregate demand basically influences actual GDP, and if actual GDP basically changes, right? If it changes around potential GDP, it's going to create a business cycle, okay? So, for example, if actual GDP is greater than potential GDP, so let me just call it AGDP, is greater than potential GDP, it tends to mean that a country is generally producing a lot of goods and services, and generally it tends to mean that the country is in an expansion, okay? And if actual GDP is less than potential GDP, generally it means that the country is actually sort of like in a recession, okay? In a recession, right? So in that sense, changes in aggregate demand will actually change actual GDP, and in turn influence business cycles, okay? So there are four main theories under this, four main subsets under this, right? And we're gonna take a look at all of them, okay? The first one is what we call the Keynesian cycle theory, not the new Keynesian cycle theory. We'll actually look at the new Keynesian cycle theory later, okay? But the first one is what we call the Keynesian cycle theory, okay? And according to the Keynesian cycle theory, changes in GDP only depends on how businesses feel about the market, okay? So changes in aggregate demand, which actually influences actual GDP, right? And changes around potential GDP comes about because businesses feel some way about the economy or about the market, right? And if businesses feel some way about the economy, it's either they invest or they don't invest, okay? So changes in investment, which again is businesses purchasing physical capital. Right, to produce goods and services, right, is driven by business confidence. And that is the only factor, or that is the major factor that actually influences aggregate demand and hence influences actual GDP, which will then fluctuate from potential GDP causing a business cycle. Okay. Now, remember that we said when businesses have higher expected profits, okay, they tend to invest more. Okay, so investment increases. Okay, well, when investment increases, we already know that aggregate demand is influenced by, so aggregate demand is Y, is influenced by consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. Okay, right, so let's say businesses are feeling really confident about the market, okay, right? They think their stock market is doing well, they think the economy is basically doing well, so they expect higher profits. Well, if they expect higher profits, they actually invest, meaning that they'll buy more physical capital to produce more goods and services, okay? And when they invest, okay, aggregate demand basically changes, okay? On the other hand, if they're not feeling confident, right, because they don't think the stock market is doing well, or they don't think the economy is basically doing well, they won't invest, and investment decreases and aggregate demand basically gets slammed, okay? Right, so according to the Keynesian cycle theory, right, changes in aggregate demand, which actually affects actual GDP, comes from only changes in investment, okay? Comes from only changes in investment, and that's the Keynesian cycle theory, okay? And then now we have the monetary cycle theory, okay? So I personally adhere to the monetary cycle theory, okay? It's one of the cycle theories that actually makes sense to me personally, and I sort of believe in it, okay? What the monetary cycle theory says that no, it's not just investment, which is driven by, you know, business confidence that actually affects aggregate demand and hence affects actual GDP, which fluctuates from potential GDP and hence causes business cycles. Is actually a combination of consumption expenditure and investment expenditure, because consumers have a huge role to play in the economy, right? And they argue that, well, even though as investment expenditure and consumption expenditure, it has nothing to do with business confidence or consumer confidence. It basically has to do with changes in the money supply, okay? So fluctuations in both investment and consumption expenditure influenced by changes in money supply changes aggregate demand, okay? So now the next thing we need to ask ourselves is basically, how does the growth of money, for example, if money supply increases, right, which essentially is the growth of money, how does the growth of money influence investment and consumption expenditure? Okay, so now we need to do a bit of unpacking. Now remember in chapter 8, we said that when money supply increases, nominal interest rates decrease. Okay, now when nominal interest rates basically decrease, okay, it actually makes borrowing cheaper, so firms will borrow more to actually invest. Okay, so firms generally tend to borrow to actually invest in goods and services. Okay, so investments will increase. Now if investment increases, we know that GDP will increase as well. Okay, now at the same time, when money supply increases, interest rates fall, and now if interest rates are falling, people tend to spend more. Think about it. If interest rates are falling, people tend to borrow loans, and also they tend to spend more on their credit cards because it's actually cheaper now. Okay, so people tend to spend more, and since people are spending more, that increases consumption expenditure, and that also increases aggregate demand. Okay, so that is how money supply affects aggregate demand. Also, when money supply changes, For example, if money supply increases, people feel like they have more money. Okay, they have this illusion of having more money, right? So in that sense, they actually tend to consume a whole lot more. Okay, and when they consume a whole lot more, GDP basically increases as well, right? So in that sense, basically what drives the economy is essentially money. Okay, so money makes everything go around according to the monetary cycle theory. Okay, money basically drives the economy. Okay, right. And then we have what we call the new Keynesian cycle theory. Okay, well, first of all, we go through the new classical cycle theory. Okay, and the new classical cycle theory says, well, it's really not, well, aggregate demand, yes, affects, business cycles or causes business cycles, right? But it's only unexpected changes, right? Changes or things that we don't expect, which influences aggregate demand. Those are the only things that basically lead to business cycles, right? So for example, the financial market, recession, nobody expected the financial market to basically crash, and that actually led to a recession. COVID-19 recession, nobody expected the COVID-19 pandemic, and that basically led to a recession. Okay, so unexpected changes, things people can't anticipate, are the only things that lead to business cycles. If people anticipate changes in aggregate demand, well, it won't create any business cycle because people will keep on spending or people will not keep on spending, right? So there's no fluctuations in basically seen in the economy. Okay, no fluctuations in the economy, right? So that is the new classical theory. Okay, new classical cycle theory, right? And then you have the new Keynesian cycle theory that says, well, that is true. Okay, I mean, if you look at the data, yes, unexpected changes in aggregate demand, some unexpected shock happens and it influences aggregate demand. For example, the COVID pandemic doesn't make spending as much. This doesn't make spending possible as much as it used to be. Okay, so in that sense, yes, unexpected changes in aggregate demand leads to changes in business cycles. But at the same time, you can't neglect the fact that expected changes, such as expected changes in investment expenditure and consumption expenditure, also influence aggregate demand and hence lead to business cycles. Okay, and hence also lead to business cycles, right? So these are the four major theories, right, that try to explain business cycles, at least in any general economy. Okay, right, these are the